Hello and welcome back to Adventures in Miniature. Today we're going to do some Allied Death Dealers. Now I really like these models. I think they've got a really nice design to them. You can't get hold of them on the Dust website anymore, but you can hunt them down on eBay and they're pretty cheap to get hold of. I think aesthetically they're one of the best looking Allied armies you can get. I think it's a bit of a shame that they're not really available to buy as a force anymore, but hopefully they'll be re-released. Quite like the overall design of these miniatures, and I think the one I'm looking forward to painting the most is probably the 30 cal machine gun. He looks like he's going to be a lot of fun. I already based these with some grout, so I'm going to separate the body and the head and then use some Mod Podge mixed with black paint to seal in the bases. After that, I used a bit of liquid green stuff to seal the gap between the torso and the legs. I used a cotton bud with some water on it to smooth out the green stuff and left that to dry for a little bit. Once the bases were dry, I used some army green to paint up the greatcoats and the fatigues, and I used a grey to undercoat any parts that were going to be armor plated. After the grey was done, I got some dark green and went over the armor plating. This started out quite shiny, but later on I was going to use some weathering to matte it up a little bit. When I first started painting these, I was doing everything light green and dark green and it looked a bit boring. So I've started leaving one of the shoulder pads blank to paint up in squad insignia later. After that, it was time to get some black and undercoat the guns and the boots, and then come back with a metallic coat and some weathering for the boots later on. For the gloves and the boots, I used leather brown from Army Painter. This came out quite nicely and it took a highlight really well later on. I also used this for the fur lining of the coats. Time to do some dry brushing, so I like to use Lead Belcher from Games Workshop to do most of my weapons. I think that comes out quite nicely and it gives me a nice subdued metallic colour instead of being overly bright. Next I used a nice dark oak brown from Army Painter to do most of the furniture on the guns, so all the little handles and grips. I find it's a really nice dark rich colour. I also used this for the leather straps that were holding the armour together. For the 30 cal machine gun, I used the same dark green that I put on the armour plating. I think this took the weathering quite well later on. So it took quite a few coats to get the shoulder pad to be a true yellow. After a while I left that to dry. Once the yellow shoulder pad was done, I used a couple of washes to go through and add a little bit more depth into the models. I used a green camo tone for most of the clothing. For the guns, I used Nuln Oil primarily. For the gloves and the backpack, I used Agrax Earthshade, which gave me a nice deeper brown colour and added a bit more dimension. After the washes had dried, it was time to do some dry brushing. This is usually my favourite part as it starts to really highlight all the details on the model. So I used an off-white colour to dry brush the greatcoat, and this brought out a lot of the folds and some of the details. After the yellow had dried and the weathering was done, I came back and did a freehand black stripe across the yellow shoulder pad to make it look more like a squad marking, and then went over with some weathering to dirty it up a little bit and make it match the rest of the armour. I used Lead Belcher to go around the edges of the armour, and mostly focusing on the shoulder pads where most of the wear would be. After that, I went over it again with some Typhus Corrosion to make it look a little bit more beaten up, and then came in with some dirt to add a little bit more life and make it seem like it had been outside and being used. When it came to weathering the 30 cal machine gun, I used a bit more Lead Belcher again just to do the edges of the box to make it look like it had been hauled around and dropped and essentially been through hell. So I like to make these models look like they've been out and seen action quite a lot. So I like to add a lot of dirt and a lot of grime to them. I started with dark brown to seem more like fresh dirt that was still wet, and then as it started to dry up I used a mid-tone brown and then finished with Xandri dust on the very top. I think Xandri dust has probably been one of my favorite colors to use of late because it's such a wonderful weathering color, so I use that in dry brushing quite a lot. So I've been trying much harder to get faces that I like. I've been experimenting quite a bit, but what I seem to have found that works for me is I like to do the eyes first. So I'll paint the eyes out white first, and then I'll use a few different skin tones to create a bit of depth. For this one I used Bugman's Glow as a base, and then I used Cadian Flesh Tone on top with a tiny bit of Kislev Flesh to highlight. And in between that I was using Reikland Flesh Tone to bring out some of the details. For the helmets, I started with the same dark green that I used for the armor. Then I used Leadbelcher again to go around the edges of the goggles. I used a leather brown to do the strap, and then finally Rhinox hide for the glass in the goggles. Once I had the heads glued in, it was time to start working on the bases. For the bases, before I've been using the Games Workshop basing paints, but this time I decided to experiment a little bit and used some Snowflock mixed in with some Mod Podge, and that essentially created a really nice texture paste that I could then spread across the bases and layer up as I wanted to. Right, so that's us done. As I've said, these are probably aesthetically my favorite faction to paint. They're pretty simple, but there's all these little details that you can add. I think face-wise, this is probably the best I've done so far. I've really enjoyed painting these, especially the weathering. That's probably my favorite part to do right now. So I hope you guys are enjoying these. I'm gonna try and keep making them as long as I can. Thanks for watching, and hopefully I'll see you guys next time. Bye.